Go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you all, and to all of you who might be viewing this later or via live stream. It's wonderful to have you with us. My name is Cheryl Toth, and I'm one of the people on the organizing committee, a group of folks from the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Lutheran ELCIC churches in Saskatchewan. And we do this in the spirit of the covenant with which we join with one another and with the Ukrainian Catholic churches in Saskatchewan. Nick Justin is the guy who let you all in, and will be handling any technical difficulties we might have as we go along. This is the second of our webinars on exploring our sacred texts, and today's topic is hospitality. Before we begin, before I introduce the panel, I'm going to begin by acknowledging the land on which in which we're present, and the peoples of the land as well. This webinar is coming to you from Regina, which means we're on Treaty 4 territory, and this is the traditional lands of Nahiawak, Nakaway, and Nakota people, and the homeland of the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Métis people. And we acknowledge this with a deep awareness that we are called to reconciliation, and there are things for which we need, because of which we need to be reconciled, including some of the mission and ministries of the churches that have been part of this province and a part of this gathering today. So we do that both with a sense of acknowledgement and a willingness to move forward in truth and reconciliation with one another. I'd like to now introduce the panel. We have three folks who are joining us for all 3 weeks, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak today. So the first is the Reverend Amanda Curry, who's minister at First Presbyterian Church here in Regina, has been since 2017. She previously ministered in Saskatoon and has just completed, on top of being at First Presbyterian, being moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, a 2-year term. She's vice president with the Canadian Council of Churches, and is part of the Ecumenical and Interfaith Committee of the Presbyterian Church, and many other national ecumenical and interfaith initiatives. So we thank Amanda, who's, like all our panelists, very busy people, for giving us her time. Second, I'd like to introduce Imam Dr. Mohamed Maswell, who will speak second. He's the leader of the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan in Regina, an RCMP chaplain, teaching assistant at the University of Regina. He previously studied at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo and earned a doctorate in Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Foundation in Indiana. So, thank you for giving us your presence today and your knowledge. And then thirdly, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Jeremy Parnes, who's the spiritual leader of Beth Jacob Synagogue here in Regina. Jeremy has a long involvement in multi-faith and community organizations, including the Regina Multifaith Forum, Habitat for Humanity, and many City of Regina committees on various social issues, and on several inner city boards, including Youth Connexions and the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. So thank you for joining us, Jeremy, and to all of you for the work that you do to make our common life richer and deeper in the ways you encourage the faith within your own communities. We're going to, the format for today is to have opening prayer, and then our panelists will speak in turn as they've just been introduced. There are questions, a time for questions and comments and responses primarily through the chat. And then the panelists have an opportunity to speak again briefly in closing, in a closing prayer. Our opening prayer will be led by Imam Dr. Mohamed Maswell. Mohamed, please. Would you lead us in prayer?
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you. Thanks so much for the invitation again. It's a great pleasure, privilege to be here again. I always try to find time for meetings like these. Thanks so much for the invitation and for the inclusion. My opening prayers today are going to be the first chapter in the Quran, which we recite every day at least 17 times. And it's actually called the opening, Al-Fatiha, the opening. So I'm going to recite this in Arabic first. I would like for you to join me in these prayers, and then I'm going to say the meaning in English. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praises and thanks are due to Allah, the Lord of all worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you are displeased with or those who are astray. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. Amanda, if you would begin our conversation about hospitality.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Imam Mohamed, for your opening prayer. It is good to be here with you and Rabbi Jeremy again this week for another faith conversation, this time on the theme of hospitality. When I think of hospitality, my mind immediately goes to things like dinner parties and receptions and other gatherings with food, fellowship, and laughter. I think of Tuesday lunches with the seniors of my congregation that used to happen pre-COVID, pizza parties with the youth of the church, visits to the homes of parishioners with tea and cookies or meals shared, and potluck suppers that brought us all together where there was always way more food than we could ever finish. I'm sure that all of our faith communities are missing the ways we used to be able to share with one another before the pandemic, and the good feelings that went along with those gatherings with food sharing and fellowship. But when I began to think about the theme of hospitality in the Christian scriptures, I noticed that hospitality is about more than just families and friends getting together. Certainly there is encouragement in the Bible for Christians to gather to worship God, gather to share meals, and make sure that everyone has enough. And the Gospels show that Jesus spent a lot of time eating and drinking with groups of people, his disciples among them. The Gospel of Luke in particular is absolutely brimming with stories about meals and hospitality. But the thing that was surprising and different about Jesus and all the meals he shared during his years of ministry was the people he chose to eat with. He was criticized for hanging out with tax collectors and other sinners. He shocked people when he welcomed women, children, foreigners, and sick people that others would avoid. The Greek word that is typically translated as hospitality or hospitable in the New Testament is Philoxenos. Literally, it means love of the stranger. Hospitality is not so much about setting a beautiful dining table for your family on Thanksgiving. It's about making space at whatever table you've got for someone who wouldn't normally be included, who might go hungry, who has a need that you can fill. Although the life and witness of Jesus gives Christians a model to follow for hospitality, we haven't often been very good at following his lead. The history of the church includes more fear of the stranger than love of the stranger. And in many ways, we still struggle to make space for the differences and diversities that could be enriching our society. If we truly loved the stranger, as Jesus teaches us to do, what a difference that would make. I want to give credit to a Bible study resource on hospitality produced by The Thoughtful Christian that notes how hospitality is central to the identity of Jesus and therefore critically important for those who claim to follow his way. The Thoughtful Christian points out that when it comes to hospitality, Jesus is the stranger, the host, and the meal itself. Now, Christians have become so used to thinking of Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God that we may forget that he lived as a human being who was poor, vulnerable, and frequently misunderstood. The Gospel of Mark shows Jesus as both an unknown Galilean peasant and the Son of God who gathers people to learn about the coming kingdom of God on earth. Strangely, while persons possessed by evil spirits knew the true identity of the peasant, the disciples and others remained somewhat clueless. Jesus becomes the quintessential outsider, misunderstood by many people, and he must rely on the hospitality of others. Jesus travels around the region to teach and preach and heal. And as he does so, he relies on people to receive him, to welcome him, and to feed him. You may remember something Jesus said when he was being realistic with a would-be follower about what his way of life would be like. In Luke 9:58, Jesus said, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Those who choose to follow Jesus discover that they will experience that same kind of vulnerability when they go out to do the things that he did. In Mark 6:10 and 11, Jesus instructs his disciples, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you, as you leave, shake the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." The Gospel of John reflects a similar idea in its very first chapter, poetically describing Jesus as the one who came into the world from God, but the world did not recognize him as God's very presence with us. We did not receive God in our midst with hospitality. We did not love the stranger, but rejected and crucified him. However, the Gospels also depict Jesus in the role of the host, suggesting that early Christian hospitality involved both relying on the kindness of others and caring for the stranger in one's midst. It is noticeable that all four Gospels include the story of the miraculous feeding of a great crowd, sometimes more than once. When the disciples want to send the people away to buy their own food in town, Jesus tells them, "You give them something to eat." It seems like an impossible task to feed so many strangers out in the countryside, but Jesus receives the offering of a small boy and multiplies a few loaves and fishes into a feast with more than enough for all. Matthew and Luke also show the centrality of the Christian as host with the use of banquet narratives. The invitation in each story is extended to all: the poor, the crippled, the blind, and everyone willing to come. And with stories like the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus shows that even an outsider may be one who offers hospitality when it is most needed. We need to let go of our stereotypes, assumptions, and fears of those whom we do not understand. In the Gospels, Jesus is the stranger guest who hopes to be welcomed into our lives. And Jesus is the host who welcomes us all with particular attention to the least, the lost, the rejected, and the forgotten ones. But at a final meal with his friends, before he is arrested and killed, Jesus also becomes the meal itself. In Mark 14, Jesus and his disciples share the sacred Jewish ritual meal that celebrates the beginning of Passover. During the feast, Jesus declares that the bread shall be his body and a blessed cup of wine his blood. As they are fed and nourished by the food given to them, Jesus promises that his whole self, his whole life, will give them the gift of life forevermore. In the sacramental meal that was instituted at this Last Supper that Jesus shared with his community, Christians believe that Jesus himself welcomes us to the table, forgives us of our sins, feeds us with his own body, and draws us close in communion with God and one another. And then Jesus sends us out to welcome, forgive, feed, and give ourselves for others. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is the beautiful story of two disciples on the Sunday that Jesus rose from the dead. These friends of Jesus are walking away from Jerusalem and towards a town called Emmaus after witnessing the horrors of Jesus' arrest, crucifixion, and death. Although they've heard some rumors that he's alive again, they are confused and upset by it all, and they likely don't believe it. As they walk away in disappointment and despair, because their hopes of a redeemer for Israel have been dashed, a stranger comes and walks beside them. The reader knows that the risen Jesus is the one who comes alongside them, but they do not recognize him at first. Along the road, they tell the stranger about what happened in Jerusalem and express their disillusionment. And he talks to them about the scriptures and the things that happened and how it all fits together. When they get to the village of Emmaus, they invite the stranger to stay with them. Night is falling, and they offer the appropriate hospitality to this one that they met along the way. But when they sit together to share an evening meal, the guest becomes the host, as Jesus takes bread, blesses and breaks it, and offers it to them. Then their eyes are opened, and they recognize that it is Jesus who is with them. The last time they shared a meal with him was just a few days earlier before his arrest. He blessed and broke bread for them that night also, and told them that his broken body and poured out blood would be given also for the life of the world. In Christian hospitality, Jesus is the stranger, the host, and the meal itself. And Christians are called to follow his lead, receiving his invitation to the table just as we are, extending hospitality to others without distinction, and giving our lives, our gifts, and our resources to feed all God's children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and for drawing in so many passages for us to consider in what you presented. So lots to think about, but we're going to shift now and invite Imam Mohamed to speak, if you would, on the text you have brought to us this day.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for your beautiful talk. I really admire and love Prophet Jesus, Jesus peace be upon him, and people who speak about him, and especially people who have experience in your tradition like yourself. I really liked your talk about the love of the strangers and how Jesus was a stranger and the host at the same time. And then at the end, you said he was the meal as well. I just liked the way you spoke about him. I really love him so much. I love Mary also so much because they're spoken about in our tradition with a lot of respect and admiration. So I will speak also about the love of the strangers and the immigrants. I will just start from there. The first text I would like to start with from my tradition, my scripture. It's in chapter 59, verse number 9. In this particular verse, God is narrating to us what happens when Prophet Muhammad migrated from the city of Mecca to the city of Medina in Saudi with some of his companions after the rejection they have received from the people of Mecca at that time. And he's also speaking about the generosity and hospitality, because we know these two qualities actually they overlap. They overlap. The generosity and hospitality they come together hand in hand most of the time. So we call the group who migrated from Mecca to Medina the Muhajirun, the immigrants, and the group who received them in Mecca, Al-Ansar, the one who supported them. You can look at it the way you look at Canada, for example, and the way they welcome immigrants. You can read this text in the same context, or it's going to give the same exact meaning. And let's read together and see what Allah is saying. He says, as for those who had settled in the city of Medina, it's talking about Al-Ansar, the supporters, and embraced the faith before the arrival of the immigrants from Mecca. They love whoever immigrates to them. So that is the first quality, to love the stranger. So this quality also agrees with the quality that Amanda just talked about from the tradition of Jesus, peace be upon him. They love whoever immigrates to them, never having a desire in the hearts for whatever is given to the immigrants. That's number 2. Number 3, they give the immigrants preference over themselves, even though they may be in need. And this is a very difficult quality for us to implement. When we are generous towards others, or we have hospitality towards other people, when we give preference to others over ourselves, preference to the strangers over ourselves, that is something hard to do. And then he said, and whoever is saved from the selfishness of their own soul, it is they who are truly successful. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once he arrived to Al-Madinah, when he migrated, as we said, from Mecca, he said 3 things to people that they need to learn and implement. You can find this in one of our collections of prophetic narrations. It's called Riyadh al-Salihin, number 1166, in which Prophet Muhammad said, Ayyuhan nas, all people, because his message, as we believe, is for all humanity. It's not only for a particular group of people. He said, all humanity. Afshu salam. The word afshu in Arabic language is to promote something, is to promote something to everyone around you. Promote peace. Afshu as-salam. Wa at'imu at-ta'am. At'imu at-ta'am, and share food with others. He's here speaking about hospitality. To share food not only with your neighbors, with people who are in need, also with people who are not in need. share food with others. وَصَلُّوا بِاللَّيْلِ وَالنَّاسُ نِيَامٌ, and pray when others are asleep at night, so that you will enter paradise safely. So if you can achieve these three qualities, and one of them is hospitality towards everybody, especially strangers, you will be able to make it to paradise safely. Another text that I would like to focus on from the Quran, which always comes up when we speak about hospitality in our tradition. It comes from the story of Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him. In chapter 51, verses 24 to 30, God says, "Has the story of Abraham's honored guests reached you, O Prophet?" Basically, God sent some angels in shape of humans to achieve some mission. On their way, they passed by Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, and they had a conversation with him. They were going to give him a glad news of a newborn for him and his family, for him and his wife. So God is saying, has the story of Abraham's honored guests reached you, O Prophet? Remember, when they entered his presence and greeted him with peace, he replied, "Peace be upon you." Even though he did not know them, but he still replied, "Peace be upon you." Then he said to himself, "They are unfamiliar people. I don't know those people." What he did after that, in verse 26, then he slept off to his family and brought a fat roasted calf. The reason why he slept off and he went secretly in a way that nobody would recognize is that he did not want his guests to know that he's going to prepare a meal for them. And this is the way that Abraham, peace be upon him, wanted to show hospitality. He didn't want to tell his people or his guests so they wouldn't leave. He slept off to his family and brought a fat roasted calf and placed it before them, asking, "Will you not eat?" Another text I would like to quote from the Quran is in chapter 22, verse 36. It is speaking about sacrificing animals. Why do we Muslims sacrifice animals? Especially during Hajj pilgrimage, when we go to Mecca in Saudi and we go around the sacred house in Mecca. Why do we do this? And why do we slaughter animals? Why do we sacrifice animals? Especially in our Eid al-Adha, in our feast. Why do we do this? People always ask this question from our community and from other communities too. The reason for this is mentioned, the purpose of sacrificing animals is mentioned in chapter 22, verse 36. God says, "We have made sacrificial camels and cattle among the symbols of God, in which there is much good for you. So pronounce the name of God over them when they are lined up for sacrifice." For those of you who might wonder, what do you mean when you say halal food? For Muslims, for example, they always ask for halal food. Halal food means the name of God is mentioned over the animal when it's lined up before it's sacrificed. Once they have fallen lifeless on their sides, you may eat from their meat and feed your friends, neighbors, and the needy. And again, I would like to repeat here that this is not the Quran itself, this is the translation. The translation can be different from one translation to another, but you have to go to the meaning in Arabic language first and then give the translation. So that the meaning here in Arabic means وَتُطْعِمُونَ الضُّيُوفِ وَالْأَصْدِقَاء. So you may eat from them and feed your friends, neighbors, and the needy. The reason why I'm saying this is if you go online, you might find a translation that gives a different wording in English. The last text that I'm going to share with you is from the prophetic tradition again. It's in the most authentic book of prophetic narrations, which is called Al-Bukhari, number 6475. Prophet Muhammad says, "Whoever believes in God and in the last day should say what is good or keep quiet. And whoever believes in God and in the last day should not harm his neighbors. And whoever believes in God and in the last day should show hospitality to his guests." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, and for drawing our attention to different parts of the sacred writings. And I'm sure this is an opportunity, before I turn it over to Jeremy, to remind folks that if they have questions, you can put them in the chat, or comments, you can put them in the chat at any time. We won't sort of take them up until everybody's had a chance to speak, but if you, like me, have different things that you're thinking or writing down, then feel free to enter them into the chat. I'm now going to ask Jeremy if you would.
Thank you, Cheryl. And as always, as with last week, a pleasure to be sitting here with all of you, but especially with Amanda and Mohamed, to share these thoughts and look for ways that we can intertwine our understandings that would be a good idea for the world somehow. So last week I started by giving a definition of generosity. I'm going to give a definition that I found of hospitality on good old what I call Rabbi Google. Hospitality is the relationship between a guest and a host, wherein the host receives the guest with some amount of goodwill, including the reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. Louis Chevalier de Jaucourt describes hospitality in the Encyclopedia as the virtue of a great soul that cares for the whole universe through the ties of humanity. Okay. So, quote, some text, 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 to 17. One day, the prophet Elisha visited Shunem, a city. A wealthy woman lived there, and she urged him to have a meal. And whenever he passed by, he would stop there for a meal. Once, she said to her husband, "I am sure it is a holy man of God who comes this way regularly. Let us make a small enclosed upper chamber and place a bed, a table, a chair, and lampstand there for him, so that he can stop there whenever he comes to us." One day he came there. He retired to the upper chamber and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, "Call that Shunammite woman." He called her, and she stood before him. He said to him, "Tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. What can we do for you? Can we speak in your behalf to the king or to the army commander?" She replied, "I live among my own people." What then can be done for her?" he asked. "The fact is," said Gehazi, "she has no son, and her husband is old." "Call her," he said. He called her, and she stood in the doorway, and Elisha said, "At this season next year, you will be embracing a son." She replied, "Please, my lord, man of God, do not delude your maidservant." The woman conceived and bore a son at the same season the following year, as Elisha had assured her. Reading of this text would suggest that there was in fact no intent for reward when this lady established hospitality and care for a stranger. There's no indication there was any expectation for something in return, but it is clear from this text that good things often come from acts of hospitality. In the book of Exodus, the children of Israel escaped long years of backbreaking servitude as slaves, and with the help of God became a free people. Every year we look back on this pivotal event in Jewish history and celebrate Passover, the Freedom Festival. Every year we gather around our dining tables and celebrate this event by recounting the story to our children and to each other. To this day, large groups gather together in each other's homes to celebrate, and we, like the generations before, recount the history of Passover. We read from the Haggadah, the book of telling the history, where we are reminded in this, the first month of the Jewish calendar, to invite all who need a place to join us Great way to start the year. At our synagogue every year, we celebrate this event in community, always inviting all who wish to join us. It is a wonderful event and one well attended. And indeed, breaking bread together and displays of hospitality throughout the year are common and an accepted part of being Jewish. In fact, Amanda, you made reference to the Passover Seder, as the Last Supper. Jesus, a good Jew, was sitting around that table at that time. But I think, and I have to say that within the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, there is ongoing, love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger, remember that you were once slaves in a strange land, be welcoming. Remember when people visit, when people come to live in your country, that they must be welcomed and they live on the same basis as equals to you. That appears many, many times in Torah. I particularly like the reference to love the stranger, accept them in your midst, because it actually appears in the Torah 36 times. Double 18. The number 18 in Hebrew is chai, yud chet, which also means life. So the word chai, meaning life, and the letters, each having a numerical value in Hebrew, yud chet is 18. And the idea of loving the stranger is double, 36. It's mentioned 36 times. I like that. The best known example in Judaism of hospitality and how it should be performed is illustrated in the early part of the book of Genesis. Interestingly, we read this portion of Genesis. We read this portion of Genesis just last Saturday, where we recounted the hospitality of Abraham. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. The Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men approaching him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree. And let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. Then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way." They replied, "Do as you have said." Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of choice flour, knead and make cakes." And then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy who hastened to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate. Here we have the terms of reference required for providing hospitality as it should be performed. There is perhaps one concern in the reading of this text. Was this a selfless act of hospitality or rudeness toward the Lord, toward God? Remember, the first verse says, the Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre, where he was sitting at the tent, at the entrance of his tent. And then the next verse, looking up, he saw 3 men coming and he ran to them. Here's what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, may his memory be for a blessing, explains. The interpretation of the chapter affects and hinges upon the way we translate the word Adonai in Abraham's appeal. As with Arabic, as Mohamed pointed out, words in Hebrew do not necessarily translate the same way as you would translate, say, from French to English. We unpack the language. In this case, I'll go back and I'll explain. The way we translate the word Adonai in Abraham's appeal, please Adonai, if now I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by, I pray you, from your servant. That's verse 3. Adonai in this case can be referenced to one of the names of God. It can also be read as my lords or sirs. So Adonai, both is a name for God and a name for other people who you might greet in this way, in a formal way. In the first case, Abraham would be addressing God. In the second, he would be speaking to the passers-by. This is an extraordinary fact because it suggests that Abraham actually interrupted God as he was about to speak, asking him to wait while he attended to the visitors. According to Jewish tradition, the passage should be read thus. The Lord appeared to Abraham. Now Abraham. He looked up and saw three men standing over against him, and on seeing them, he hurried from his tent door to meet them and bowed down aside. Turning to God, he said, "My God, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not leave your servant, i.e., please wait until I have given hospitality to these men." He then turns to the men themselves and says, "Let me send for some water so that you may bathe your feet and rest under this tree." This daring interpretation became the basis for a principle in Judaism. Greater is hospitality than receiving the divine presence. Faced with a choice between listening to God and offering hospitality to what seemed to be human beings, because of course at that moment, Abraham was unaware that they were angels, messengers of the Lord. Abraham chose the latter, and God acceded to his request and waited while Abraham brought the visitors food and drink before engaging him in a dialogue about what was to be the fate, in this case, of Sodom and Gomorrah. How can this be so? It seems disrespectful at best, heretical at worst, to put the needs of human beings before attending on the presence of God. What the passage is telling us, though, is something of immense profundity. The idolaters of Abraham's time worshipped the sun, the stars, and the forces of nature as gods. They worshipped power and the powerful. Abraham knew, however, that God is not in nature, but beyond nature. There is only one thing in the universe on which he has set his image, the human person. Every person, powerful and powerless alike. I hear that in Jesus, by the way. The forces of nature are impersonal, which is why those who worship them eventually lose their humanity. As the book of Psalms puts it, the idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, nostrils but cannot smell. They that make them become like them, and so do all who put their trust in them. Psalms 115, verses 4 to 8. One cannot worship impersonal forces and remain a person. Compassionate, humane, generous, forgiving. Precisely because we believe that God is personal, someone to whom we can say, you. We honor human dignity as sacrosanct. Abraham, the father of monotheism, knew the paradoxical truth that to live the life of faith is to see the trace of God in the face of the stranger. I just want to add one more element to this. Joseph Soloveitchik was a major American Orthodox rabbi, Talmudist, and modern Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. In his book, A Halachic Man, he writes of hospitality requiring certain constraints. To paraphrase, Rabbi Soloveitchik tells us that we are required, in addition, not to overwhelm the recipient with hospitality, but rather to also leave them space to express and be who they are. His example is God's expression of hospitality. For the Holy One made space to create the world and all that was in it by exercising what we call tzimtzum, contraction of God's self, in order for the world to exist. In truth, I feel that the concept, I think it is fair to say of hospitality, that it is no more unique to people of faith than it is to society in general. It makes sense that to build and maintain community, hospitality is a cornerstone for so many practical reasons. But people are not always practical or reasonable. hence the need for hospitality to be enshrined and taught in the foundational texts of our respective faiths. Sometimes hospitality is impossible. For example, during a pandemic that isolates and limits gatherings and the ability to interact, or it may seem so. Thankfully, we have the blending of science and faith, Zoom, and our religious communities to hold us together until, please God, we will once again be free to sit together and break bread. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Well, there's lots there for us to think about from all three speakers. So I'm inviting you at this point to put some questions into the chat. We're doing that in part because there's a lot of us here, and we tend to be a bit, as I'm demonstrating right now, a little more concise when we type and put something in than when we're talking. So if you have things that you want in, that you would like to brought to people's attention and panelists' attention, you can address one to each or to them all generally. I want to go, while I'm waiting, I want to go back to the interplay between being hospitable and welcoming a stranger, and what we were constantly fighting with a bit in our own society. And that's to go to when Amanda was talking about love of the stranger, Philoxenos, and what we have, which is fear of the stranger, very often xenophobia. And so I just wanted, if any of you wanted to sort of talk about what do you think, what do your traditions say, or what do you think it is that plays into us becoming more xenophobic, more afraid of strangers in our society rather than welcoming of them? Any of you could speak to that?
If I may.
Please, Jen.
We're living in an online world right now, but we're living in an online world anyway. More and more, we are seeing people narrowcasting instead of broadcasting. We're seeing an era of echo chambers, people within their own echo chambers. Think about it. When all you do is hear and listen to and talk to people who agree with you, who think the way you think, and nobody else, it breeds fear of others. It's the way that works. It's human nature. And I think that that is part of the problem that we're dealing with right now. We need to somehow expand dialogue away from these echo chambers and go into the much broader sphere, looking for the other, just as we are here today.
Amanda, Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what you're asking about connects really well with some of what Mohamed was talking about in terms of immigrants. And I was jotting down some of the points around loving immigrants, not desiring what immigrants have. And it was the piece in particular to give immigrants preference over themselves, even if we are in need. And it seems to me that we certainly within North America, the resistance to immigration that is often rooted in kind of a fear of whether there's going to be enough, whether there's going to be enough jobs, whether there's going to be enough whatever, and that sort of wanting to guard and make sure that there is enough for us. So that fear of allowing others in who might somehow take something that we need. But this instruction to give preference to those who are strangers, to those who are newcomers in the land, I think is challenging. But I think that much of our actual experience has been that when we make space for others, we actually discover that we're actually blessed by the things that others bring and their experiences and their gifts that actually enrich the community. But I think it's that fear of scarcity, of there won't be enough for me if I share with others. And time again, our traditions show that when we share freely, that there is more than we expect, and that things grow, and you know, the community comes together. That maybe connects with that feeding of the 5,000 story that I mentioned. You know, that fear, we could hang on to what we have, we just have a little bit, but when we actually have the faith, the courage to share from that we're always surprised by how much abundance there truly is.
Mohamed, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I completely agree with what Amanda and Jeremy said. If it wasn't difficult for us to overcome that feeling of being worried about others taking our share, which the Quran named selfishness, you can give it another name, but that feeling of being worried that somebody is going to take my share, if it's not difficult, it will be rewarding. It's rewarding because it's difficult. And that's why God says, whoever can be saved against the selfishness of his own self will be successful. So, and second point that Rabbi Jeremy mentioned, of course, that we need to deal with a human as a human and reach out to people a little bit more, because in my community, let me speak about my community. I don't know how many Muslims are attending this meeting, but I know it's very hard for people in my community to attend interfaith events or to reach out to people from other faith communities. I don't know why it's still very hard for us until today, but I think you guys are doing much better in this and reaching out and dealing with humans as humans, like Christians and Jews.
You know, if I may, if it's appropriate, if it's okay to add another point to this. You know, when you talk about that and the fear of, you know, somebody takes from me, there's less, that's referred to as the zero-sum game, right? The idea, it's like having a cake, and if you take a slice of that cake, now I have one slice less of that cake available to me. I always remember that when we share ideas, for example, it has the opposite effect. So I can't remember who said it, but when two people have an apple and they exchange apples, they each have an apple. But when two people each have an idea and they exchange ideas, now they each have two ideas, right? And I think we need to think more in those terms. And of course, as you pointed out, Mohamed, that goes back to generosity of spirit and being open to others.
Is it possible to add something here, please? I think I really want to add something here, because I always speak to my community from the Quran perspective. You have to be a beneficial member and give back. Like Quran spoke about the idea of khushub musannada. What this means is relying against the wall. The wall benefits you because you're relying against it, but it's not taking any benefits from me, because I'm leaning against it. So this is the way the Quran describes people who benefit from others or from the community, but they don't give back. So what I'm trying to say is also immigrants are supposed to, after they're being helped to stand up on their feet, like myself, I'm one of those migrants, of course, I need to give back to the community. So it's a very important Quranic idea as well I want to add here.
Thank you.
Something that really struck me about this conversation about hospitality is with Jeremy, right at the beginning, when you shared your Google definition of hospitality, and I noticed that it started with the relationship between a guest and a host, and I became very aware of the fact that when hospitality is taking place, it's not just about someone who has resources or has, you know, a table, has food, giving that just selflessly of themselves for others, but there's an exchange that's happening. There's a back and forth. There's something that, and on all those hospitality rules, like we didn't do a lot of talking about, you know, this is how you should do hospitality, and every community and culture has its own kind of guidelines around what that looks like and what's expected of hosts and what's expected of guests. But the whole thing is that it's not just a one-dimensional thing. It's not just you're the host and you give, but the guests bring something as well in their presence, in their reception, in their graciousness, and in their response to that. And that's essential for that hospitality thing to happen, and the wonder of what that looks like. And I'm thinking, like, as a pastor in a congregation, I'm often on the receiving end of hospitality, you know, going to people's homes. I miss some of that because of COVID, but there's something important in just coming and receiving and learning from the other and engaging with them, and that is an honor to the one who is a host as well.
there are some things that have come up in the chat, so I'm going to go to that. I just wanted to add a comment that as you were talking and in that relationship, I think there is that fear that there might not be enough for me. But I also think maybe I'm just one of those slightly anxious hosts, but I think whether you're being a host or the one being received, there is a vulnerability in it. And when you're doing it across cultures where you don't necessarily know what you're supposed to do as the host or what you're supposed to do as the guest, that adds to that sense of vulnerability for everyone. And I think it makes it more complicated. And I wonder, Mohamed, when you were talking, if for a lot of the folks in your community, there's a lot of vulnerability already by coming and trying to learn, those who are immigrants trying to learn the new customs and language and everything. And so asking one more level of talking, might just sometimes feel like more, we've got enough going on in the vulnerabilities we're already experiencing. That's just my thought. I'm going to just bring out some questions that have been in there, and then you can just take them as you wish, and you can all speak. Whoever goes first goes first. But at first, a comment from Janet. When we have discussion and sharing as we are today, we find that we have more shared values and experiences than we have imagined. So I think it's part of just getting to know one another, which is part of what one does in gathering and being hospitable to one another. Dan asks, how can I share my most precious gifts? My family. I'll just go with that one, and then I'll keep going along here. Anyone have thoughts on that particular vulnerability of sharing family?
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I'm wondering if that's about sometimes people are quite isolated in family groupings and opening that table, that community to others who are not technically part of the family. I mean, I think many communities have history of making sure that those who maybe don't have family groupings have invitation to participate in other communities, of going beyond sort of biological connections to those other connections. I think that's something that is integral to the idea of welcoming the stranger, and the stranger doesn't stay a stranger. The stranger becomes part of community.
I would have to agree with that. I think, and relate that to something you said about, when you are sitting with someone or in sharing at a table, it changes the dynamic, and that's a key underlying reality on not just the local level, but on the world scale. Part of the problem, and that goes back to my sort of echo chamber concept comment, part of the problem I feel in the world with people who are not getting along often has to do with the fact that they don't know each other. They've never met each other on a personal level. And until you get a personal connection, you don't have a way of really entering into relationship. And if you don't enter into relationship, and therefore hospitality, especially sharing just a meal or having a coffee with someone, changes that dynamic. It's the beginning of something that I think is very powerful. I was asked by someone something about sharing, could you say more about nature and finding God there? I'm not sure where that came up from, but I don't want to ignore it, I guess.
It may be a message you received. I don't know if I've
okay,
seen it.
I know it's a direct message.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's okay. I wasn't sure if I'd missed it or not. I was thinking, and then I'll go to the next question. We'll see if we can get to that. But that even within our faith communities, various faith communities, we often meet in groups where we're in the context of the place of worship and whatever other space there is around the worshiping space. And so we're not necessarily home to home. And so I think that's another level of getting to know one another or being hospitable to one another, that our culture, North American culture, kind of mitigates against, right? You don't let people into your home that easily. I think, you know, that might have been different generations ago, but, you know, a lot of the fellowship that we have as faith communities, however we want to put it, is in the context of our joint space and not the personal space of our homes, and not the more intimate space of family. And I don't know what that says, but I think that's part of what we might be dealing with as well, about how do we actually become family, or get to know families differently across whatever barriers we might already have.
I think it's a good point. It's not simple, Cheryl.
Yeah.
An example from my perspective is being a part of a group that brought a Syrian family here to Regina, and they extended hospitality to us. And so I was over there with family. Now, within my family, members of my family, I have members of my family who are Muslim. I have members of my family who are indigenous, as well as a First Nation, Lakota Sioux, and also Christian. And we came to their home for a meal. And the first thing that was noted was the abundance of food from a family that had just arrived and clearly didn't have the sort of means. And so you don't want to put people to that. I know people here would go, let's bring them to us. Let's not bring us to them, because look what we're doing to them. They're going to bankrupt themselves before they even get started, sort of thing. But that is a natural reality of hospitality in the Middle East, certainly. For me, it was very easy. I have family from Iran and from Iraq, as well as from Israel. And so I'm kind of like the lucky guy here. I know what's going on. We understood each other. We immediately had a connection together. But the awkwardness of my family who came with me, I suddenly realized that I should have perhaps prepared them a little bit beforehand. But I think it was a good surprise and a good shock, because ultimately it led to some really powerful experiences and some really hard questions, and therefore some very positive understanding that otherwise would be lost.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment on what you mentioned about hospitality in the Middle Eastern culture. Yeah, I mean, it can be unhealthy sometimes. That they invite you to food and they sometimes force you to eat, right? So it's good to be to be generous towards other people, but at the same time, I always speak to my community as well. Just try to be also healthy. Don't force people to to eat too much. After I got married to my wife, she's Canadian, was born and raised here, and for example, if they invite you to eat, they ask you to eat. If you say okay, it's okay. If you say no, I'm full, I cannot eat, they leave you alone. But in our culture, they don't leave you alone. You have to eat. So it can be unhealthy sometimes. Just wanted to comment on this.
Thank
As
you.
my weight will attest, we have the same problem in the Jewish culture as well.
Yeah. A sign of hospitality and love. Okay. There's a question here. Are non-Muslim and non-Jewish people welcome at faith services? Sort of what are the customs around hospitality to those who are not of the same faith in your faith community? And that could be, Amanda, you could chip in.
Certainly, anyone who wishes to come to services at our synagogue or to join us online, more than welcome. It's probably better if you come, because you probably don't have our prayer books, and if you're going to come, we have them in Hebrew and in English, so you'd be able to at least understand some of the liturgy that we utilize as well. But very welcome, always, not a problem. It's just not an issue. I'm sure it's the same in every faith pretty well.
Yeah, same thing here. I think this question is also directed to me because it speaks about Muslims and non-Muslims, and absolutely. We always have open houses in our mosque, and even during prayer times, if you want to come attend and observe, see what's going on, what we do inside, we would love to have you at any point. Absolutely. Just try to make sure to put your mask on. That's all.
All right, thank you. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything, Amanda.
No, just ditto. I've enjoyed opportunities to be a guest in both Jewish and Muslim communities for worship and other open houses and things like that. And in a Christian context, one of the things I love, I've had the experience a few times of welcoming someone, sometimes from another Christian tradition in my church, and a few times from another faith group. And I just love the opportunity to answer questions and explore from someone's experience, not from a perspective of someone who comes is there to be converted, but simply to learn about one another and to share that engagement. And it's a great opportunity to do that.
Thank you. There's a question here, or a comment. As a devout Christian, I learned so much about hospitality from the Syrian refugee family for which I was host family in the first year they were here as refugees. Lessons I have taken to heart, my life is enhanced, which goes to what you were talking about, I think, Jeremy, as well, in terms of, well, all of you, in terms of the what happens when you engage with others in a way that welcomes them and is hospitable, the benefits or what you learn or how you grow is not necessarily what you expected, but it's a blessing. There's a question here. You could comment, but I'm going to throw out another question too. There's a question about tensions or difficulties between Shiite and Sunni Muslims, and so what are those difficulties or tensions? Because how is it? And this could be. We're asking the question of you, Mohamed. That's the way it's coming through. But for Christians and Jews as well, there have been, if not now, always times when we have not always been hospitable to one another, and the groups within which the various subgroups within our own faith communities. So, if you could you comment, and then maybe Amanda or Jeremy, you might comment out of your own history as well.
Should I speak about the Shi'i and Sunni, I think, right? Okay. Again, before I came here, we had some problems, of course, in our mosque between Shia and Muslims. Like sometimes, I don't know if I should speak about problems we had inside of our community, but some of them, for example, got kicked outside of our mosque because they don't want Shi'i in a Sunni mosque. But since I came, or after I stayed for 3 years, that never happened again. I was the first Imam to offer funeral prayer on one of the Shi'i brothers who passed away. I have no problem with that at all. Yeah, I mean, it's a historical issue. There are some historical issues. It's civil wars between Sunni and Shi'is. We shouldn't fight over them today as Muslims. That's how I see it, and that's how I learned at Al-Azhar. That's my approach. Some people don't agree with this because of the culture. I mean, it's they can do whatever they want, but I do in my mosque what I also think is right to do.
Sorry, historical differences. Amanda or Jeremy, do you want to say anything? I mean, certainly Christians know a lot about killing one another in the midst of the Reformation that formed a good number of us.
Historical and current differences,
yeah.
And certainly within the Christian Church, we are doing a lot of work in terms of coming together and growing understanding. We have history that involves lots of killing one another and lots of excluding one another, and but we continue to make progress in that regard and to be hospitable to one another. I personally come from a context where different Christian groups are coming together, in that I'm a Presbyterian and I'm married to a Roman Catholic. And the hospitality that we receive from each other's communities as we participate in both those communities, they're not together. We haven't become one church, and yet even with our differences, we are received and welcomed and participate in both those communities in significant ways. So yeah, lots of work internally within our traditions, as well as between faith traditions.
I think I actually referenced at one point, maybe it was last week, 2 Jews, 3 points of view. For me, that's actually a good thing in many ways, but it can get quite passionate. And that's okay as long as we remain collegial. And of course, within different Jewish sects. So there's orthodoxy, as there is in Christianity and certainly in Islam. Very often, I mean, I think that they're not a part of a faith, they're a part of another group altogether in some ways, depending, you know, I don't mean, that didn't come out right, but I think you understand. I think that's less faith than it is human. We can get a little bit too invested or so invested in our particular belief or point of view that nothing else is right. And I think that's where the issue may be the problem. And it's a shame because with dialogue comes perhaps, I'd like to believe anyway, greater understanding and an opportunity to be more gracious.
And perhaps part of it for all of us is how we negotiate differences or learn to be with one another despite and get a sense of the differences. And sometimes that includes just to, you know, going back to the origins of what some of those differences are to see how they formed and they're not. Because very often when we emphasize difference, we give them a moral value that they don't necessarily have to reinforce why they're different and not to understand where those differences come from and where our commonalities are. Are you about to say something, Mohamed, before I'm about to ask you all to speak? So, but did you want to say anything?
Not really, unless there's a question directed to me.
Okay, sorry. No, I don't. I'm just a comment here from Nubuku. I hope I pronounced that right. I think it's important to understand that being welcoming guests and host has cultural implications and norms. My favorite story is about two women trying to connect, one in whose culture serving coffee comes at the end of the visit, the other was serving coffee happens at the beginning of the visit, resulting in a confusion on social clues. So yeah, it goes back to, I guess, what our differences are and things that are so embedded in our culture, we don't even think of them as something about which we need to talk, right? Because it should be obvious to everyone, it's obvious to us. And figuring out what those differences are and how we learn from one another about what it means and how we can be hospitable to one another. We're at 4, just 4:15, and so I don't know if any of you want to comment, but I think that's a really helpful comment, and you know, perhaps it's some of the smallest ways of learning about one another and comes when we have these conversations and being open, as you said, Jeremy, to being with one another and not in our own sort of echo chambers. You're all asked to be able to, if you would bring a few more minutes of anything you might want to say or emphasize or something you've thought of since we began that you want to bring forward. And we'll do that in the same order with which we began. So Amanda, you're first, then Mohamed and Jeremy.
Thanks, Cheryl. I want to mention just before we close, there were so many things from Jeremy and Mohamed's sharing that I found so fascinating and rich with possibilities. I particularly appreciated that you both made reference to the story about Abraham and the visitors, which as a Christian, I love that story too and would easily go to the same story. But it was really lovely to hear some of the insights coming from your own experience and your own tradition that it will have enriched my understanding of it. Mohamed, I loved the part where you talked about Abraham kind of slipping away, sneaking away to prepare the meal, which made me think of like the wonder of a surprise hospitality and that aspect to it, which was really interesting to hear about. And Jeremy, I found it. When I wrote down this, Abraham interrupted God, asked God to wait while he attended to the visitors. And that is a piece I never would have clued into before. And I found that just fascinating. Also kind of connecting with something that came up last week when it came to generosity, that that attending to the needs of another can sometimes trump the sort of piety of worship or attending to God particularly, and that sometimes, you know, I talked about Jesus breaking rules at times because the need was great, and so responding to that immediate need was more important than following the rule. And then I thought about the fact that that in doing so, in Abraham choosing to attend to the needs of those visitors before attending, saying, God, wait for a bit, I have to do this first, indeed actually ended up being the host to God's presence in the community, which is the surprise. And then it made me think of another gospel passage from Matthew 25, where Jesus says something similar, that he says, whenever you cared for the least of these who were in need, those in prison, those who were hungry, those who were any kind of need, you cared for me. And again, a call to hospitality that invites us not to be hospitable to others because we think we're going to get something from it, but invites us to care for each person that comes across our path. And the surprise and the gift of that is that when we do so, we actually are caring for God and receiving from God's goodness in our lives. And what a blessing to be a part of that system, community of hospitality as guest and as host, and as offering ourselves as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. Mohamed.
Yes, it is always beautiful to know that we have a lot to share, as I said last time. I heard today Amanda was speaking about Jesus, peace be upon him, as a stranger and a lover and a host. And I love him, as I mentioned. And I love to listen to stuff about him from people who know his tradition, and about Mary as well. And Rabbi Jeremy, when he talked about that the idea of love to the stranger is mentioned, he said 36 times, which is double 18. And 18, as I understood, he said in his tradition, it means life. And also when he shared the story of Prophet Abraham, the father of monotheism, I also like that, because we need to really focus on our commonalities and what we have to share than our differences. And regarding speaking about the Syrians and their hospitality and generosity, I think I will pass your message on. So next time they can attend the meeting, inshallah. I hope so.
Thank you. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mohamed. I would really appreciate that. In fact, I should give them a call. It's been a while. You know, you get caught up in life and you get busy, and things should happen that don't happen that should. Thank you both for your presentations. I loved the connections, the connectivity. I'm here, I'm going to say something about the Passover and the welcoming people to the table. And there you are, Amanda, talking about Jesus, a fellow Jew from my perspective, sitting at the Passover table. And I really like the idea of showing the concept of Jesus, bringing his total self, in effect, to both sides of the process of hospitality. Both as a guest and as a host, and really offering himself in that way. It actually is helpful to me in understanding a little bit more of, I think, the concepts of the blood in the body, right? Which is something as a text that I have difficulty with. So that was very helpful. And Mohamed, sharing our shared text with Ibrahim, of course, always a pleasure to be able to bring the families back together in conversation and discussion like this. And I just feel a bit closer to you, and hope that we are able to, in fact, sit together at a table and talk more about this. Amanda, you should join us as well, of course. But it makes me want to do that. And these are our commonalities, and that's where we can start, but it should allow us to go into our differences in a way that is both wholesome and worthwhile, because that's what ultimately we need to be able to respect the dignity of our differences. This is very helpful to that process. Thank you.
Well, I thank you all. I want to thank you because one of the things that you're doing is demonstrating to me hospitality to one another in the way that you welcome in one another's comments and insights and understanding of the text that you bring. And that in itself, this is, in one sense, we're engaged in an exercise of hospitality with one another. And for all of you who have been participating in the comments and the ways in which you enter into the conversation as well, I think is part of engaging in a hospitality with one another and being willing to share your thoughts and your insights. I go back to what I was saying. There's a way of being a host and being the one received, the guest that says something about both sides of what that's like, and it is a kind of a vulnerability of bringing yourself and what you offer, and that's what we're trying to do here is bring what we offer and listen to one another and share with one another. There was a note I missed as we went through that I saw just at the end, and that was now I've lost it because my screen's changed, but it was I've lost who said it or wrote it, but it was about the potlatch, the indigenous hospitality way of ritual of hospitality, and it struck me that acknowledging at the beginning the land that we're on and the peoples of the land who came before we as newcomers came, for those of us who were newcomers at some point. It's a reminder that by not being hospitable, by wanting to discourage the gifts of the stranger to us, we lost some ways of understanding hospitality that need to be recaptured or brought back to us. We might both encourage the customs that teach hospitality and learn from one another. So thank you for that comment. Before we have the closing prayer, which Jeremy is bringing to us, I just want to remind folks that this is being will be available on YouTube on the Diocese of Regina's YouTube channel. It'll also then be on the Diocese of Coppell's YouTube channel. And so I've had a few questions from people wondering if it's being recorded or where they can find that. And so that's a reminder. And you can also let your folks in your faith communities and friends and neighbors know if they want to be part of this by listening to the session, or if you want to listen to them again. Next week will be our final of this 3-session webinar, exploring our sacred text, and the focus next week will be on compassion. Wanting to remind you of that, and I now ask Jeremy to bring us to closing in prayer.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'll invite you to take a moment, take a breath. I want to offer deep thanks to Cheryl and Nicholas and the others whose names I don't have in front of me, who I know helped make this possible, to all of you who have participated by being here with us and with the questions that you have sent us, with gratitude to my co-presenters, Amanda and Mohamed, and with deep love to the Holy One of Blessing for making all this possible. And I'd like to close with a blessing in Hebrew. The English, I was going to try to put it together with because it's a melody that comes with it, but I didn't get a chance to put the English, to develop the English so it would fit. But what it says is, Hareini mekabel alai, behold, I hereby take upon myself, et mitzvat haboreh, the instruction of our Creator, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your fellow as yourself. Seems to me the appropriate closing to this session. הריני מקבל עליי מצוות הבורא, ואהבת לרעך כמוך, לרעך כמוך, הריני מקבל עליי מצוות הבורא, ואהבת לרעך כמוך, לרעך כמוך. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. That prayer was a blessing. And thanks to all of you. Farewell for now, and we'll see you all hopefully next week.